Esto es La Inquietud con Garret Edwards. El lugar donde hay más preguntas que certezas.
Damos vuelta de página aquí en La Inquietud por CNN Radio Rosario. Tenemos un enorme honor, placer y privilegio. Es un viejo amigo, hace mucho que no hablamos. Tiene un MBA, un Master of Business Administration de la Universidad de Georgetown en los Estados Unidos. Ha trabajado en diversas NGOs, en organizaciones no gubernamentales en los Estados Unidos y también en otros países como en la India. Ahora trabaja en el mundo de las finanzas, ¿sí? Sabe muchísimo de venture capital, de private equity, sabe también de emprendedorismo. No es otro que Tarun Vats, quien está del otro lado. And now we'll be speaking in English. Tarun, dear friend, how are you? Garret Edwards over here.
Thank you, Garret. Muchas gracias por la invitación. That's the extent of my Spanish, I would
That's
say.
Perfect.
Thanks for having me on the show. It's great to be reconnected and have this conversation with you.
Thank you for joining, Tarun. As I said, you know about finance. If you had to explain in the simplest terms what private equity is, if you had to explain it for someone who has never heard the term, what would you say?
Yeah, I think maybe I'll take a step back to give a landscape of what venture capital or private equity is. Think of it as, Garret, you have an idea. You want to go start a company. Now, your idea is not as big as for a bank to go and give you a loan, right? Now, you're seeing all these companies like Uber or like Amazon that were smaller companies back then. Now, they go to these financial institutions such as the venture capitalists or private equity funds. That's more in the later stage to essentially get the seed capital. Now, I have an idea. I want to go run the money. I could look, what are the sources of capital here? You could either go to the family, right? You could either go to friends. You could either go to angels, or you could go to venture capitalists. So where venture capitalists come in is an area where the company started to put the idea together. They're trying to grow, and venture capitalists come in with the infusion of capital, infusion of their networks, infusion of their relationships in terms of hiring talent as those companies grow. So in the very basic essence, think of it as you're going to private markets to take capital to start a business or grow a business.
That's really interesting. So I guess that there are advantages going to a venture capitalist than going to your family, for example, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we joke about it here. Family and friends around is oh yeah, I got to go set up a company. Our family's putting $10,000 or let's say $50,000 if you're lucky.
Yeah, you go ask an uncle or an aunt or a cousin, right?
Right. I mean, I would love to have rich uncles and aunts who can just fund my business. But as I think about growing the business or putting that first product out, there's a lot of iteration goes into it. Garret, as you might have heard, think of it as when Uber was building their business out, for example, right? They had to go out, do a lot of interviews. I'm just taking this as an example.
Yes.
They had to go figure out this technology platform. Now, all of this work takes heavy infusion of capital as companies start to grow. Now, uncles and aunts can only write small checks. I wish they could $1 million checks or
yes,
multi-million-dollar checks.
Unless you have Bill Gates as an uncle or someone like that, then of course it's going to be a small check.
That would be the ideal dream, right? So as you think about it, so people go to these funds, if I may, and these funds basically help in terms of the capital infusion. And most of these venture capitalists are founders, right? They have built the companies themselves. They understand the different life cycles of a company, where they can both come in with the mentorship approach as well as their network, where as companies think about growing, you also need talent. And this is VCs are talking to so many different people. They have so many experts in their Rolodex, if I may. So how do you connect capital with talent to grow an idea is how I would put it, the broader VC landscape.
I like that idea, how to connect capital and talent. And how hard was it when we didn't have technology like we have today to connect capital and talent?
I think it must have been hard. If I were to assume, think of Jeff Bezos or think of Mark Zuckerberg's back then, or like even the early stage of like Silicon Valley. Like if you think about the evolution of Silicon Valley, like these were engineers who were working in the semiconductor industry. They did good, made some money, and as they started making money, they were like, oh, innovation is a force of disruption in the society, right? So how do you, one, bring this disruption to the society through the access of capital, to the access of talent? And that's how like Silicon Valley grew. Like now, if I were to take a trip down the history lane, Silicon Valley is known as Silicon Valley because of the growth of semiconductors there. First came semiconductors, right?
Which probably people don't remember nowadays, because now you just listen and hear Silicon Valley and you think, okay, so companies, right? Tech companies, but people don't think about the conductors.
Absolutely. So if you were to indulge me there, so it started as semiconductors, right? Now semiconductors help build hardwares. Hardwares led us to internet. Now internet led us to cloud computing, and now cloud computing is going towards AI. So it's like it's an evolution in the sense, and I think with VCs it's more about like what's the vision looking in the 10, 20, or 30, or even 100 years, right? So you're betting on an idea which is riskier, but there's a risk reward profile here if we think about it in terms of like pure finance terms. Now you're going to be investing in 10 companies. One of those companies are going to be successful, but what you have done by doing that investment, you have looked at 10 different ideas which could in the end create disruption, could be beneficial for the work we are doing, right? Could be beneficial for society. Like no one would have thought about the use of like AI in healthcare, like how AI has been able to like detect different strains of like cancer, or like how fast they are able to do that with that computational power. So I think as a VC, to me, what comes in mind is you're using that capital to invest in a riskier idea, but there's a huge upside to it if that idea works. So you're supporting really smart people with great ideas that can create disruption in the economy. There's a good side to it. There's a bad side to it. There's, as you're aware, like there's good capitalism, bad capitalism. But I think people forget the fine lines between the two.
We'll go back to that idea about good and bad capitalism, but I would like to touch upon the statistic that you just mentioned, which is probably one of the most known statistics about venture capital, which is, okay, so you the fund might invest in 10 companies, but one of those ideas might be the one that actually hits it, the one that actually becomes a success. But even those other 9 end up being useful in the way, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think if you think it from I'm purely talking from an economic mobility point of view, if those companies are doing great, right? Where are most of the jobs coming from? Businesses, right? You're investing in these, let's say, hypothetically 10 companies. 9 of them don't become unicorns. When I say unicorns, what I mean is they don't go on IPO, they don't have an IPO and like become billion-dollar companies. But they're still there, right? They're still employing people. They're still creating this opportunity for individuals within an economic system, right? So I feel even though those companies were invested in, they may not be fund returners from a financial metrics perspective or from the growth perspective, but at the end of the day, they are like employing people. Now, an argument could be made, yeah, but like what all of these things fail, right? Yes, there is a possibility. There's a risk of like failure, but I think the beauty there is, I think creation is a binary process. What I mean by that is, in order to create something, you go from 0 to 1. So the experience that you learn from 0 to 1 is always going to be useful for those who are in the business. Like if a founder fails, it keeps the passion going. Like I want to go back, like and build something new. And what lessons can I learn from this issue? So I feel like it's causing some sort of like economic mobility, forcing the founders to think about what's next. And there are lessons to be learned in failure. If everyone was having success, then I don't think we would be growing.
Yeah, we wouldn't be learning anything new. It's like the Beatles. From every mistake we make, we must surely be learning. Tarun, you mentioned bad capitalism, good capitalism. Why do you think that there's sometimes a divide when discussing all these things and issues that become so ideological? When we were, for example, discussing economics and statistics just now.
Yeah, I think there's a difference between crony capitalism versus like good capitalism. I think, to me, and I'm not picking a side here in the sense of like, I think it's both the private sector and the public sector come together to create an ecosystem. So there is not one force that can go build it by itself. So let me start with that. When I say crony capitalism, I'm talking about, monopolies. I'm talking about businesses creating those monopolies and trying to squeeze out of every end user. When I talk about good capitalism, I think one of my mentors says, the world needs good bankers. And what I mean by that is you need to be investing in things and ideas that are going to be beneficial for society. Like Uber came, what Uber did, it brought out so many people to the mainstream economy. Like, I'll take an example. You see all these like elderly people like staying at home, right? They came and became part of the workforce even after like doing their regular jobs. You have women coming in and like being part of the mainstream society. And I'm talking it pure from like the developing world. I come from a country where like, women are mostly staying home, raising kids. I took a trip to Nepal and I saw this phenomenal startup that brought Uber-like model to bike ride sharing. And I was fascinated by when I was doing like these trips and having conversations with people who were part of this bike ride sharing company. The number one reason I learned that why this bike ride sharing company was successful is because they were integrating people that couldn't be part of the workforce, such as like women or like elderly in that part of the world, and which was truly fascinating and a very humbling experience.
I like that story, Tarun, and sometimes people, instead of speaking of capitalism, they speak out entrepreneurship. Do you think that those concepts are related, that one maybe describes in a better way what you just were telling us?
I think everyone is an entrepreneur in one shape, some way or form, right? I mean, look at you, Garret. Like you have been like doing so many things outside of like, your regular job in terms of like, we're having this conversation, right? To me, entrepreneurship is about hustling and also about like, what problem are you trying to fix, right? To me, it's more about if there is a problem in the market, someone's going to try and fix it. And an entrepreneur does a really good job of identifying that problem and making sure that problem gets sorted out in a meaningful way. For example, like this startup I was talking to you about, right? Now, if you think about the problems in Nepal with this ride sharing, there are only taxis available. Not saying that taxis aren't good for economy, but think of it as there are so many bikes out there. He just took the idea of, and let me give a little bit more context here. Nepal is landlocked. It's full of like hills. And now add more cars on that, it's going to be super crowded.
Yeah, it's so like you're only going to have cars on the streets and no space on the streets left.
Exactly. So what people started doing, they're like, Nepal has one of the largest consumptions of like two-wheelers. So what I mean by that is a lot of people like prefer having a two-wheeler because it's easier to navigate. And he saw a problem. He saw like taxis wouldn't go to areas which were sparsely populated. So how do you use this mechanism to, one, solve for the problem of accessibility, two, increase the workforce and make workforce part of the mainstream, and three, like there's also a social aspect of it, right? Jobs in these parts of the world, and I don't want to generalize it, is mostly reserved for men, right? So how do you sort of create this gender equality with some of these ideas? So I think that's what I mean by, entrepreneurship is a force of finding the problem and trying to take a holistic approach to solve that problem.
That's also a good point that you're making, Tarun, because when people discuss venture capital, when people discuss private equity, they seem to focus on the numbers, but not on sometimes the results that you get. Results that have to do with real people in places that can be as far away from the place that the money was raised, right?
Yeah, I'll take a financial lens to it, Garret, and I'll take a social lens to it. When I say the financial lens, someone who is in the finance business has a fiduciary responsibility to their investors, right? So, and I'm not saying like you have to squeeze every return metrics.
Right? every penny, like on the same side.
Yeah, but you also have to be efficient with that penny, right? So you're going to be investing in ideas where you believe. It's not spray and pray. It's more about like, okay, how about I think this idea is going to solve the problem, and what can it do for the people who are investing in it, as well as what it's going to do for the society. Now, off late, you might be hearing in the last 10 years or so, there's this new concept of impact investing, right? What that means is you're looking at, there are two kinds of investors. They're like impact first, and then there are like financial return first impactors. But I think finance as overall has been a force that solves both sides of the equation, both in terms of the impact as well as financial returns. So anything that you can think of at the end of the day is being done for the betterment of the society. Whether it is new bank trying to bring more and more folks into the financial as part of the financial inclusion, whether it is Uber or that bike ride share company that I was talking to you, trying to bring like more people to the workforce, they're all trying to solve problems in the society in some way, shape, or form.
I have always meant to ask you this, Tarun, because you have worked at NGOs, you work at finance, you did your MBA, but you also studied engineering at first. What do you think engineering taught you? What tools it gave you for the path that you ended up traversing?
Thank you for that question, because I often wonder like why I went down the engineering path and now I am in finance.
Because I mean, one tends to think of engineers. People with that do finance as well. That they work with numbers and they do designs and they are organized and meticulous. But engineering it's not an easy thing to study. I mean, I studied law, which is far more easier than engineering.
I think you're a smarter man, Garret. Like law is harder. So let me start by saying that
it's definitely not. Trust me, it's not.
But coming back to your question, I think engineering helps you sort of logic out things. You start having a framework in the mind, and you start solving problem in a more analytical or logical way, if I may. And my education in engineering helped me sort of like break a complex problem into smaller chunks, and take that framework approach to like, oh, this is wrong. What are the different aspects within that problem that I can solve for, right? So, and I think also like a little bit of number crunching or the quant side, you started like seeing how numbers matter. But that's one side of the equation. And the reason to go to do an MBA was I feel like those two degrees helped me visualize the softer side, whereas the people side and the broader like business knowledge of like how companies work. And I'm still learning. I'm not an expert by any means. And I think it's a good combination of having that logical bent as well as like the softer touch of the maintaining the people relationship, if I may.
You said numbers, and I'll follow up on that one, because in Argentina, and it's happening in many countries, children, they learn less and less mathematics, and the results that you get when you check the standardized international tests showcase that they know less math than they should. How do you, if you could do something to help in the sense of a recommendation or a suggestion on how schools and countries should deal with children learning mathematics, what would you say?
Yeah, so I think I'm by no means an education expert, so I leave the job to the experts here. But if I were to, think about that in a broader sense here, Garret, if I look at Latin America, I break down Latin America in terms of the opportunity from a startup lens. It's a very young and growing population, right? I mean, if you look at four of the biggest economies, Brazil, Argentina, Chile, and I would say even Colombia, right? You have a younger crowd that has a lot deeper appreciation for digital technology. That's one. You look at regulations that are slowly like going down in terms of providing access to capital to some of these young and talented individuals that go overseas and come back and they want to change things. And three, to me, is now we're starting to see this human sort of like customization and desire for newer things and a physical infrastructure that's lacking that. So if you now combine those three things, it's a great recipe for opportunity. Like I'll take an example for Argentina, and I'll come to the education piece. Is Argentina has historically been an agri-based country, right? Like, I mean, agriculture has been the biggest export there.
Yeah, definitely.
So there are a lot of opportunities on the ag tech. But with the recipe I'm like trying to tell you, it also opens up like bigger opportunities on the education side. Now, startups that are coming in are thinking about like gamification of education. What I mean by that is kids who are in the schools, I mean, at least in US, and I'm not sure like what the case is in Argentina, you're starting to have like this digital approach to education, right? So what that means is you can teach math, science or any other subject
through games, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. So I feel like there's a lot of appetite in the K through 12 ecosystem where like edtechs, educational startups can come in and solve some of the bridges in addition to what's being conventionally taught in the industry. So I think to me it's a function of both public and private side, and they both have to come together and try to figure out like, hey, yes, there's a broader need for math and science here, but what beyond that can be solved as you start thinking about catering to this like younger talent that has an appetite for digital world, if I may.
Penultimate question, Tarun, and this one is the self-answering question. Was Tarun Vats happy when Argentina won the World Cup last year?
Oh, I was rocking my Messi t-shirt. I sent you a picture. I remember that.
Know. I remember.
I still need to get my 3 stars, and I'm glad Messi is here in Miami now.
They are hard to come by even in Argentina, the 3 stars jerseys. Don't you worry. I mean, they're even hard to find there because they were not a lot of them.
I'm glad you said that, because I was like, I need to get my hands on that jersey, because now, as you know, like Messi is here in Miami, so hopefully one day I can make that trip down and I can still see him like playing. I still have the NOB cap.
I mean, I would try and do that fast, because I think it's like only like another year and a half left on his contract. But he's still making the rounds there. Still watching and following football, right, Tarun?
Yes, sir. The football in the real essence, not the American football, if I may.
Last question, and this one we ask out of every interviewee, because the show is called La Inquietud, and the name in Spanish it's a pane. I mean, we have to choose a version when we ask it in English. What makes Tarun Vats restless?
Great question. I think I constantly think about, there's so much to learn out there. Again, like last night I was watching this docuseries on Netflix, if you haven't checked out, called Blue Zones, and the idea of that was essentially, how do you improve longevity for our lives? But like, what's making me restless is there's so much information out there. Like, how do you start like getting that knowledge from all these sources? In the sense that like, I feel like I'm a kid in the candy store. Like everything I see, I want to learn more about it. But the time is limited. And how do I start saying no to certain things and like yes to other things? So I get restless about those kind of things. It's like where I need to say no versus where I need to say yes, because everything I see around is fascinating. And I think it's just hard to not be restless about how much knowledge is out there.
Thank you very much for the time you have shared with us and with our audience, Tarun. We send you a really, really big hug.
No, thank you for having me. This is great to catch up and share my thoughts. So thank you for having me on the show.
Lo teníamos a Tarun Vats aquí en La Inquietud por CNN Radio Rosario.
Esto fue La Inquietud con Garret Edwards. Síguenos en redes sociales y en www.edwards.com.ar.